Hi, folks. I'm Zach Hackworth. I'm a research forester with the University of Kentucky Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. And I'm excited to be with you on the podcast today to talk about just an amazing species of bird that we have here in Kentucky, the common raven. And the raven is a species that not a lot of people know about. And in fact, it's a relatively new species to the state, not historically, but in more recent decades. And so my hope with this segment of the podcast is to give you some ways that you can identify ravens and also to give you a little bit of history on the recolonization of ravens to the state and some of the ongoing research that we've got going here at UK. So inevitably, whenever I mention ravens, the first response of people is always ravens. Oh, you mean crows? You're just talking about a large crow, right? But in fact, ravens and crows are two different species. Even though they might look very similar on the surface, both being relatively large black birds, they are indeed two unique species. And they have two unique sets of life history strategies and ecologies. So the first thing I want to do is give you some ways that you can identify differences between the two birds. So on the surface at the outset, ravens are very large birds. They stand upwards of about 2 feet tall, weigh upwards of about 4 pounds, and have a wingspan of about 4 feet. Whereas in comparison, crows are much smaller, stand only about 21 inches tall, weigh about 1 pound to 1.5 pounds, and have about a 3-foot wingspan. So comparatively speaking, ravens are much larger birds. Some identifying features between the two. The easiest way to tell the difference between the two is to look at the head. So common ravens have a very large beak. It almost looks disproportionate to the size and shape of their head. So that beak is predominantly covered in feathers, with those feathers extending typically over halfway along the length of the beak. Crows have this feature as well, where they have feathers growing out on their beak, but the extension of those feathers is certainly much less than on ravens. Another way that you can tell the difference is by looking at their throat feathers. The throat feathers, or the hackles, on ravens are very pronounced. You can see how those feathers are very fluffed up, whereas on crows, those throat feathers generally lay quite a bit flatter. If the species are in flight, you can tell that a bird is a raven by looking at the shape of its tail. Ravens have what we call a wedge-shaped tail, meaning that it's wider in the middle and comes to a little more of a pronounced point at the tip, compared with crows that have a fan-shaped tail or a more typical hawk-shaped tail, where there is no prominent point. It almost approximates a semicircle. One very easy way that you can tell the difference is by listening to the vocalizations. So everybody is probably very familiar with the common call of a crow. Again, let's remind ourselves. Right, so that's a common crow call that you've heard probably in your backyard or in your woodlot. But ravens sound quite a bit throatier, and it's more of a cronk call. So let's hear that. All right, so ravens have a cronk call. It's very deep. It's very throaty. You can pick out single individual notes, very different from the caw sound of the American crow. And their ecologies are different. So common ravens, when they're selecting nest sites, will generally build their nests on cliffs. And that's a common hallmark of ravens. Even though they do build their nests on in larger trees or on certain human structures, they like to nest when available, on cliffs, as opposed to crows that are very happy with building their nest in trees or shrubs. Thinking about foraging, common ravens are almost predominantly scavengers, meaning that they forage on carcasses of dead animals, whereas crows are a little bit more omnivorous. They'll eat some fruits and nuts in addition to animal meat. So after I give people a little information about the species, their first comment or reaction to me is, wow, I didn't know we had those in Kentucky. And a lot of people don't. And a lot of people are surprised to find that they're even in the eastern U.S. at all. But this is the range map of ravens, and we can see that ravens are found predominantly all over the West, all over the western U.S., and in parts of New England and in parts of Appalachia. But in fact, prior to the arrival of European colonists, ravens were found all over North America. Anywhere that there was forest, ravens were typically found. And even in places where there were not forests, like in the Great Plains regions. So if we look back at our range map, we can see that there's places in the Midwest and in the Great Plains where ravens are not found today. But in fact, they were found all over the Great Plains regions, because there were reports that they followed buffalo herds around and scavenged on carcasses. Again, a very large source of food for them. So again, anecdotal information from Native American cultures, from findings of bones from archaeological sites all across the U.S. and Mexico and Canada that indicate that ravens were widespread all over the continent prior to the arrival of Europeans. However, after the arrival of Europeans, there was quite a bit of deforestation, land clearing for agriculture, commercial hunting of buffalo, of deer, of elk, of all of the major food sources for them, as well as targeted persecution of ravens. So again, ravens, even today, are considered agricultural pests. So targeted poisonings to remove ravens, direct shooting of them, all resulted in a pretty significant decline of raven populations in the eastern U.S. up until about 1950. But luckily, starting in about 1950 and in successive decades, we started to see ravens becoming more abundant. Sources of food for them became more prevalent. Deer populations began to recover. Elk populations were started to replace the extirpated eastern elk, and common wildlife laws such as the Migratory Bird Act afforded protection to the species, and creation of national parks and national forests helped preserve habitat for them. So up until about 1950, they were declining, but starting in 1950 and afterwards, we started seeing them becoming more prevalent. And up till about 2000, 2010, ravens were very under-recognized as species that were recovering. There was a lot of anecdotal information of saying, oh, yes, we're seeing more ravens, but there were no formal studies that tracked recolonization of the species. So that was one of the things that we were interested in doing from a research perspective. We wanted to track the recovery of this species in terms of its recolonization of its former home ranges, of its former range. So what we did was obviously there were no modern technology databases present in 1950 like there are now. So what we did was we searched bird atlases, we searched publications of ornithological societies, we searched data from formal bird counts of surveys. We used online forums that were available in later decades. We even conducted personal interviews with people who saw ravens 20 and 30 and 40 years ago to compile this database of raven sightings between 1950 and 2016. And so what we did was we took those sightings, we put coordinates to them as good as we could, and we tracked range expansion by decade. And so this figure shows our result. The top panel shows the decade estimate of raven range in Central Appalachia, while the bottom level shows the individual sightings. And so if we look at the individual sightings in 1950 and 1959, we can see that ravens are found predominantly right along the core mountainous areas of Central Appalachia. But in successive decades, we see that there's expansion along the Appalachian mountain chain. But in decades later on, in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, we can see westward and eastward expansion into lower elevation areas until finally, by about 2016, we see that ravens have completely infilled all of the range in Central Appalachia and are very common in the Appalachian region, which was very encouraging to find. In Kentucky, the patterns very much are similar to other states in the region. However, we are right on the sort of southeastern extent of the ravens range. But we can see that in this map, which shows all the sighting locations known for ravens, that ravens are becoming fairly prominent, especially in the southeastern parts of the state, around Harlan and Letcher. But even across all of eastern Kentucky and the Cumberland Plateau, ravens are becoming abundant, and they are increasingly abundant every year. And I always tell people not to be surprised if they see a raven anywhere in eastern Kentucky, because it certainly is a possibility that ravens are out there and they're in areas that we don't know about. Okay, they're increasingly found every year in new areas. So that's very encouraging to see from a conservation standpoint for these species. So going forward, we know that ravens are becoming increasingly abundant in the region, but unfortunately, because they are newly abundant in the species, we haven't had the opportunity to do a whole lot of research on their regional ecology. Okay, we don't know specifically what types of habitats they are inhabiting in these regions, what things they're eating, and how successful they are at reproduction. So all of those things are important for conservation, and all of those questions are answered beginning with effective monitoring programs. So we have to be able to survey these species to know where they are, to be able to do these more in-depth studies on them. However, ravens have been characterized typically as wary species and very distrusting of humans, and that's potentially a holdover from the persecution in previous centuries. So our research question that we set out to answer was, how do we design surveys for such a cryptic species? How do we estimate their detectability? How do we determine how detectable they are, given the fact that they are so cryptic? So what we decided to do was to find cliffs with known raven nests on them. And what that allowed us to do was that allowed us to estimate how detectable the ravens are in areas where they are occupied, in areas that they occupy, in areas where they are present. So what we did was we surveyed 24 cliffs across central Appalachia, Kentucky, North Carolina, West Virginia, and Virginia. And during each one of the surveys, we recorded the amount of time it took until we detected a raven. And what this did was this allowed us to estimate how detectable the species was when it was present. And so what we found was that on average, ravens are very detectable, despite what was originally thought about them being distrusting of humans. So they do readily disclose their presence when they are there. So on average, we waited about 14 or 15 minutes until we saw ravens during a survey. Okay, so that's, again, that was a whole lot lower than we expected to find. And in fact, all detections occurred within the first hour of the survey. So on the right, you can see what's called a detectability curve, where on the x-axis, the x-axis is the survey time, and on the y-axis, we have detection probability, which is the probability of detecting the species during a survey, with 0 being that it's impossible to detect them, and 1 being that they're always detected. And so we can see that in the first 10 to 20 minutes of the survey, detection probability increases very quickly, which is indicating that ravens are very detectable. They're relatively detectable, and that it approaches 1 at about 60 minutes. So, so again, that indicates that ravens are very detectable. And this was a finding that we were not expecting to see, which is a good thing. A finding that we also uncovered in this study was that ravens are sensitive to disturbance at the nest. So even though they are detectable, they are still sensitive to human presence around their nests. So in general, the farther away that the observer was from the cliff, the higher detectability was. So basically, ravens, when the observer was closer to the nest, raven detectability was lower. So basically, they called less, tried to move less to minimize being observed by the surveyor, which is, again, not all that unsurprising. So what that tells us is that ravens are highly detectable, but they are sensitive to humans. So in general, we are cheered by this finding, and in that they don't appear to be as elusive as we previously thought. So creating surveys for them may not be as difficult as we originally thought, which is great for conservation of the species. So what are some things that you can do to help with conservation of ravens? So ravens, again, are a very new species. So a lot of people might want to go and try to find them. When they hear about raven sightings, a lot of people might try to flock to these areas. The first and foremost thing that you should think about when birding is that you need to try to avoid disturbing the birds in general, but try to avoid disturbing them at their nest. Okay, so our research shows that you need to stay at least 100 yards from that nest when you're observing, and that it doesn't matter if you're on top of the cliff where the nest is, or if you're underneath of the nest, it doesn't matter. They are sensitive to both of those. So you need to stay at least 100 yards away from the nest if you can, and try to remain as concealed as you possibly can. So if there's a forest edge, try to tuck yourself up in that and stay out of the open as much as possible, because they are sensitive and they are very good at detecting you. Perhaps a lot better at detecting us as we are of detecting them. So if you observe a raven, it would be great if you could try to photograph it or record it, record audio, and then upload that information to eBird. And what that'll do is that'll help document the location of that bird and help future research efforts down the road. Now this is important, if you do discover an active raven nest, so you identify ravens and you can identify that they have a nest. we ask that you do please contact Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. And what that will help us do is that will help us to document that nest, and that will enable us to study them further and allow us to estimate some reproductive parameters for them in the state. So I've included the URL for Kentucky Fish and Wildlife county contacts. So that's a lookup tool. You can find your county and see who would be the appropriate people to contact to come and survey a raven nest. Conversely, if you can't find a county contact, then you can contact me, and I will help to bridge that gap for you. So again, just to wrap up, ravens are spectacular creatures. And again, we're very common in Kentucky, in all parts of Kentucky, but faced some challenges for a long time. But it's great to see that as a species, they're recovering and becoming more prevalent in the state. So if you have any questions about ravens or would like to discuss anything further about any information that was presented, I do encourage you to contact me, and my email address is on the screen. I would be happy to talk with you about it and anything that we can do to help with conservation of this species. So with that, I appreciate your attentiveness and hope to see you out on the trail of ravens with the conservation of this good species.